From Prince Louis's balcony antics to August Brooksbank's royal debut, we're taking a look at the highlights of the weekend.
The gates of Kensington Palace have long hidden affairs, feuds, and scandals beneath layers of PR and protocol. But nothing could have prepared the public for what a palace psychologist has now revealed about the youngest child of Prince William and Princess Catherine. This is not rumor or tabloid gossip, but a clinical bombshell delivered by a credentialed professional hired to protect a child, one who ultimately chose that child over the institution itself. The focus is Prince Louis, the boy the world fell in love with. The cheeky little prince who pulled faces at the Jubilee, stuck out his tongue, and covered his ears on the balcony. We laughed, shared the clips, and called him adorable, the most human member of the royal family. But what if those moments we laughed at every grimace, blank stare, and sudden freeze weren't mischief at all? What if they were signs of a child in distress, expressing himself in the only language he was allowed to use? What you're about to hear may force you to see the British royal family and how it treats its most vulnerable members in a completely different light, revealing the boy behind the balcony. To understand what has now been exposed, you have to return to the very beginning, to the first time Prince Louis appeared before the cameras, cradled in his mother's arms on the steps of St. Mary's Hospital in April 2018. He looked perfect, rosy-cheeked, serene, wrapped safely in a blanket as the world photographed him from every angle, with no hint of what life behind palace gates might hold. As Louis grew, his public appearances became a study in contrast to those of his older siblings, Prince George and Princess Charlotte, who seemed to adapt to royal expectations with increasing composure, George standing straight, Charlotte curtsying with practiced ease. Louis, by comparison, moved to a different rhythm, chaotic, spontaneous, unpredictable, and adored by the public. But insiders say they saw something else entirely. Former royal staffers, speaking years later under strict anonymity, recalled a child who was markedly different behind closed doors than in photographs. Servants whispered, nannies left abruptly under the familiar explanation of personal reasons, and close aides who had long been fixtures of the household quietly disappeared, their expressions revealing what their words could not. One former nanny, still refusing to give her name, described evenings when Louis would weep for hours, not tantrums or ordinary toddler frustration, but something deeper and more unsettling. She recalled trying everything in her training to comfort him, only to find nothing worked. He wasn't throwing a tantrum, she reportedly said, visibly shaken even in recollection. He seemed to be somewhere else entirely, absorbed in something I couldn't reach. At the time, such accounts were buried beneath paperwork, non-disclosure agreements, and the quiet machinery of royal reputation management. They were inconvenient, so they were made to disappear. Yet the questions remain. If nothing was wrong, why did so many people leave? Why did so many stay silent? And why, when a credentialed psychologist was finally brought in, did she later break the very confidentiality agreement meant to protect him? The signs were always there, misread by the world. Look again at the footage of Louis at public events, including the Queen's Platinum Jubilee in 2022, and ask yourself whether what once seemed like harmless mischief still looks the same when viewed through fresh eyes. Overnight, Prince Louis became an internet sensation, pulling wild faces, sticking out his tongue, covering his ears, spinning around, and looking away from the crowd as his mother leaned in to redirect him, clips that went viral and were celebrated as proof he was the most relatable royal in history. Memes spread, fan accounts bloomed, and the laughter felt harmless, even affectionate. But when behavioral specialists later reviewed that same footage, they reached a starkly different conclusion. They weren't seeing a child clowning for attention, but a child overwhelmed. The ear covering, sudden blank stares, explosive bursts of movement followed by immediate stillness, and the rapid swing between hyperanimation and near-total emotional shutdown were read as signs of a nervous system struggling to process an intense sensory onslaught. Thunderous applause, flashing cameras, roaring crowds, military aircraft overhead, and the unblinking scrutiny of lenses inches from his face. For most children, that environment is overwhelming. For a child with a specific neurological profile later detailed in Dr. K's report, it was a crisis disguised as ceremony. And all the while, palace handlers watched closely, adjusting and redirecting. Whispered instructions during pauses, hands guiding his into a wave when his arms went still, subtle shoulder taps timed to precise moments, deliberate behavioral cues from trained adults, not gentle parental reassurance. Rewatching footage across multiple events, reviewers noticed what had always been there. Louis was being managed constantly, surrounded by a team whose job was not to comfort him or check if he was okay, but to keep the performance within acceptable royal parameters. Even hot mic recordings from backstage reportedly captured chilling directives: just keep him smiling. Take him off if he stares again. This cannot go on. And, most unsettling of all, a quiet admission from another voice. He isn't being treated fairly. That recording is the one that should stay with you. He isn't being treated fairly. Someone on the inside, someone whose job was to manage the public image of the youngest prince, looked at what was happening and named it not as inconvenient or disruptive to the schedule, but as unfair to a child. Those recordings never aired. Feeds were cut, audio scrubbed, and the moment erased from public view. But the words had been spoken, and inside the palace more and more people were beginning to agree. When the whispers grew too loud to ignore, and the departures of senior staff became too frequent to explain away, a decision was made. The palace needed someone credentialed, discreet, and capable of assessing the situation with clinical authority while keeping everything quiet. Enter Dr. K, deliberately unknown to the public, a specialist with more than 2 decades of experience handling high-profile child trauma cases, where secrecy wasn't optional but essential. Her reputation rested on accuracy, discretion, and results, built through work with the children of politicians, celebrities, and billionaires. She was brought in under a cover story as an educational consultant, vague enough to deflect curiosity, specific enough to justify her presence, with only a small inner circle aware of her true role. Bound by an airtight confidentiality agreement and granted royal-level security clearance, she entered the palace as a lifeline, the institution's solution to a problem it didn't yet grasp the scale of. And then she began working with Prince Louis. What were meant to be brief, standardized evaluations, neat assessments designed to produce a reassuring report quickly became something else entirely, as Dr. K expanded her observations beyond formal sessions. To watch Louis across different settings, patterns emerging that no carefully managed appearance could fully conceal. She observed him across environments, private spaces, and carefully prepared ones, watching how he interacted with family, with staff, and with the cameras so often fixed on his face. Dr. K was not examining behavior in isolation. She was studying a child within a system, and what she found shook her. In controlled, quiet settings, Prince Louis was articulate, academically bright, socially engaged, and warm, what she described in clinical terms as a child of exceptional resilience. But the moment variables shifted, when performance demands appeared, cameras emerged, crowds gathered, and rehearsals began, something in him changed. Not gradually, but instantly, like a switch being thrown. He would become rigid or surge into overdrive, swinging between those states with an unpredictability that alarmed the adults around him and seemed entirely beyond his own control. In sessions, Louis spoke with a clarity that went far beyond an ordinary child navigating an ordinary childhood. According to those familiar with the conversations, he described feeling trapped in noisy spaces, confused about why he was required to perform for cameras, and unable to distinguish between what was real and what was merely expected of him as a prince. He reportedly asked Dr. K a question she later said stopped her cold. "Why do I have to smile when I'm scared?" It wasn't theatrics or exaggeration, it was his lived reality. In another session, he is said to have added, "They only see me when I'm happy." That single sentence carried the weight of a book, revealing a child who felt invisible unless he was performing, who had learned frighteningly early that his emotional truth was unwanted, that fear, discomfort, and confusion had no place in the world he was required to inhabit. Dr. K knew immediately this was not a straightforward case. She escalated her concerns, formally approaching palace officials to request that Louis's public exposure be significantly reduced, arguing clearly and clinically that what he needed was not more rehearsals, not more staged photo opportunities, not more handlers, shoulder taps, or whispered instructions, but protection from the very system that was overwhelming him. She told them plainly that he didn't need more whispered instructions, he needed sustained clinical support and structured environments where he felt genuinely safe. Instead, she was deflected. She was told the public needed to see a united, joyful front, that the family could not afford speculation, and implicitly, if not explicitly, that her role was to make the problem manageable, not to disrupt the schedule. She returned to her sessions with Prince Louis, and with each one she watched his condition evolve in ways that deeply troubled her. The periods of withdrawal grew longer, the emotional disengagement more pronounced. Then came the moment that sources say crystallized her decision, when Louis looked up at her and said quietly, "I want to go somewhere quiet. but there's always a camera. In that instant, Dr. K faced a choice to remain a tool of the institution or to be what her entire career had trained her to be, an advocate for a child, and she chose the child. Her decision triggered what would later be called the report that broke the palace. Dr. K resigned, and the expectation was familiar. Her exit would be silent and swift. The NDA would hold, security clearance would ensure discretion, and she would fade back into the private professional world she came from while the palace carried on. They miscalculated. Before her resignation was even formally processed, a copy of her final internal report was leaked not to tabloids, rival royal factions, or gossip outlets, but to a global child mental health network with the standing to treat it with clinical seriousness. The organization immediately recognized that this was not a personal exposé, but an institutional indictment. The report was precise, measured, and devastating, detailing what Dr. K described as systemic neglect, not neglect born of poverty or abandonment, but of an institution so committed to projecting strength and stability that it was willing to sacrifice a child's well-being to preserve the image. It outlined emotional mishandling, the consistent prioritization of public performance over private care, the silencing of staff concerns, and the use of behavioral management techniques designed not to help Lewis, but to contain him. And buried within the clinical language was the diagnosis, one that would force the world to reconsider everything it thought it was seeing. Buried in the clinical language of the report was the identification of what Dr. K described as a rare neurological, emotional profile. She did not name it publicly, citing privacy protections and the child's right to control his own medical narrative, but she outlined its characteristics in enough detail that specialists would immediately recognize it. Heightened sensitivity to sensory stimuli such as sound, light, and sudden movement. Recurring social disengagement when emotional demands exceeded processing capacity. And intense, rapid emotional responses that could look like volatility or misbehavior to an untrained eye but were neurological in origin. The profile showed exceptional functioning in calm, low-stimulation environments and near-complete shutdown in high-stimulation ones. Dr. K concluded that Prince Louis was not a difficult child, not misbehaving, and not seeking attention through grimaces, ear covering, or blank stares. He was a child with a specific neurological makeup repeatedly placed without adequate support into the single worst environment for that profile, then managed and corrected when his nervous system responded exactly as it was always going to. The palace, she wrote, had not created his condition, but it had made it dramatically worse, and it had done so knowingly, as warnings from staff, aides, and medical professionals were raised and then drowned out by an institution that, as one insider put it, did not know how to deal with vulnerability when it wears a crown point. One line from the report, later quoted and referenced, appeared on page 14 and deserves to linger in the mind. If left unchecked, this can develop into a crisis of identity, with constitutional ramifications. Dr. K was not describing a behavioral issue that could be smoothed over with better handlers or tighter scheduling. She was warning of a child whose sense of self, his understanding of who he is apart from what he is required to perform, was at risk of fracturing entirely. And if that fracture occurred, she cautioned, it would not remain a private family tragedy. It would carry implications for the line of succession itself. The monarchy rests on perceived stability, on an image of strength, continuity, and poise, and while the future king stands at its center, Prince Louis, third in line, is still part of that constitutional architecture. A child who cannot function within the demands of royal public life does not present only a personal challenge, but an institutional one. Dr. K was not making a political argument. She was making a clinical assessment, though in this context the two were inseparable. What followed is where the story shifts from heartbreaking to infuriating. One might expect a report of such seriousness, authored by a professional of such standing, to prompt accountability, acknowledgement, and a decisive pivot toward the child's well-being. Instead, the palace moved into overdrive. Within hours of the report circulating behind closed doors before it reached the press, or the public Kensington Palace launched a full counter-narrative campaign. Louis was suddenly everywhere, walking hand in hand with Catherine through sunlit gardens, laughing in carefully framed candid photos with his siblings, smiling in images designed to project warmth, normality, and happiness. Insiders, however, knew what the public did not. None of it was spontaneous. Every photograph was staged, every frame choreographed. Press photographers brought in under non-disclosure agreements. The candid moments were anything but And the timing of the releases was no accident, it was crisis management dressed up as content at the same time. Palace officials were reportedly working the phones, calling editors at major media outlets with a clear message. Stay quiet about Louis's health, and early access to royal exclusives would follow. The transactional nature of it was as cynical as it sounds. Online, the shift was swift. Conversations about his well-being were replaced by stories celebrating his cheeky personality and hilarious royal moments, the funniest faces, the most relatable clips, content designed not to inform, but to distract. And that leaves the question that matters most. If everything truly was fine, why did any of this need to happen at all? Why the staged photographs, the media calls, the aggressive pivot to fluff? If Louis was perfectly okay, what, exactly, was everyone working so hard to hide? If Prince Louis were simply a perfectly healthy child being a perfectly healthy child, the story would have faded on its own, there would have been nothing to manage, and the management itself becomes the evidence, the suppression the testimony. The palace's response to Dr. K's report did not refute her findings. It effectively confirmed them, raising unsettling questions about the priorities operating behind the gates and the world Louis has been born into. There is a version of this story that ends with accountability, where the institution acknowledges what was found, provides sustained clinical support, and adapts to the child, rather than forcing the child to adapt to the institution, but it remains unclear whether that is the path being taken. What is clear is that a child at the center of one of the most scrutinized families in history has struggled in ways the public was not allowed to see. Those closest to him noticed, raised alarms, and were silenced, until the one professional brought in to help chose at enormous personal and professional cost to put his welfare above her own security. By all accounts, Dr. K exhausted every internal avenue, escalated appropriately, was deflected, and ultimately concluded that the institution would not protect the child, making her decision to leak the report not reckless but, in her view, the most protective act available. That necessity alone is a profound indictment of how vulnerability is handled within the British royal family. And while Louis's circumstances are extreme, the lesson is not uniquely royal. Across many settings, institutions prioritize image over well-being, manage children rather than support them, dismiss warning signs to avoid disruption, and reward performance over truth. Children cannot advocate for themselves inside systems that demand performance. They need adults willing to look past appearances and ask harder questions. Dr. K did, and the attempt to bury those questions only ensured the story would surface, leaving much still unanswered as the palace remains silent on the substance of her report and the implications for Louis's health. The royal family's communication strategy, as of now, has remained entirely focused on image control. More smiles, more walks, carefully timed releases of wholesome family content. But the questions aren't going away, they are multiplying. Who within the palace hierarchy decided to deflect Dr. K's clinical recommendations? How high up the chain did that decision go? Were Prince William and Princess Catherine fully aware of what was happening? Were they constrained by the system? Or were they active participants in prioritizing appearances over their youngest child's needs? What became of the staff who raised concerns and were dismissed with comments like, "This is not your issue. He's fine"? How much pressure were they under to maintain silence? And how many continue to carry the weight of what they witnessed? What is Louis's life really like behind those gates today? Has anything changed in how he is cared for? Or is the same machinery merely better hidden from public view? Most importantly, what does Louis himself know? Does he understand that someone sacrificed personal and professional safety to fight for him, and that the outside world is now watching differently than before? Born into a role he did not choose, growing up within an institution that was not designed with his well-being as the priority, Louis is nevertheless a child of remarkable intelligence and sensitivity, one who, in his own quiet way, has already been asking the right questions, like why do I have to smile when I'm scared? That question deserves an answer from the institution, from the adults in his life, and from all of us who have laughed at viral clips without seeing what lay beneath the performance. This story is far from over. It is only in its second chapter. The palace faces unprecedented pressure, not a scandal of affairs, finances, or public feuds, but a far more fundamental test. Whether it will protect its most vulnerable member, even when doing so demands real change from an institution built on centuries of perceived infallibility. Dr. K acted with courage few ever find in powerful systems. She chose the individual over the institution, honesty over comfort, accepting the consequences, because the alternative complicity in a child's suffering was unacceptable. Whatever your perspective on the monarchy, royal reporting, or the credibility of leaked reports and anonymous sources, that choice deserves recognition. And Prince Louis deserves to be seen clearly not as a meme, not as the cheeky little prince who provides viral moments of levity, but as a child with a real neurological profile, real emotional needs, and a life unfolding behind gates that have long hidden what is inconvenient. The world is now watching in a way it never has before. This story is ongoing, and it is time we treat it with the seriousness it demands.